Good evening. Good evening, everyone. I want to say thank you so much, all of you, for coming. It's a wonderful, wonderful crowd, a very important topic, and I'm truly delighted and honored to have Mr. Lopez Hill tonight. Excellent, wonderful speaker. Just before we start, to let you know, I know we have a lot of new faces, which is excellent to have. I'm especially delighted to have so many of you from the very large Venezuelan and Venezuelan American community here in Houston. I was telling our speaker tonight, I think, and earlier today, that probably outside of Southern Florida, this might be the largest Venezuelan American community in the United States. So thank you all so much for coming. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ronan O'Malley, and I'm the Director of Programs for the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. And I just wanted to also let you know, if any of you would like to come to other events that we have, we cover all parts of the world, definitely Latin America, but also everywhere from the Middle East to China to Russia and everything in between. My colleagues outside have information about the World Affairs Council, or if you're interested in membership, so please ask them. And also, just to let you know tonight, for some of our regular members, because we have such an esteemed guest and such a large audience, that I really want to allow time for questions. So we will go till about 8:15 or 8:20. So, I know that's a little bit longer than we normally do. And just for those of you who aren't familiar with our typical scenarios, we have question cards at the end of each rows. They're blue question cards that my colleagues will collect later on in the evening. And please write your questions on there. When we do question cards, it allows us to basically, a lot of times I'll get questions and I might have 5 or 6 people with relatively similar questions, try and combine them. And just for the sake of time and making things easier to try and address as many questions as can, that's why we do question cards. And also, just to let you know, especially for our regular members, as you know, we also have a large educational outreach for the World Affairs Council, and we always have students at our events, and as well, we also do a lot of programs specifically just for students. I know the school year just ended, so it's a little bit harder to have students here tonight, but I am delighted to have, and thank you all for coming. We have a large number of students from Houston Community College and from the University of Houston, the Venezuelan Student Union, so thank you all very much for coming. And just to let you know about 2 or 3 of our upcoming events. We're doing events all the time. We take a bit of a break during the summer for about 6 weeks from July, and then we start again in August. But any of you who might have already registered, we had an event scheduled for tomorrow on June 1st called Unmade in China, The Hidden Truth About China's Economic Miracle, with Professor Jeremy Haft of Georgetown University. Unfortunately, we've had to postpone that event. He had a very sudden and unfortunate death within his family, but we're going to reschedule that for the fall. And 2 weeks from now, we have another very timely event. On Wednesday, June 14th, we have a program called The Growing Threat of North Korea and Options for the United States, and that'll be with Richard Fontaine. He's the president for the Center of New American Security, and he's also the former senior foreign policy advisor to Senator John McCain. And lastly, a very interesting program we have that's a little bit different than what we normally do. At the end of June, on Tuesday, June 27th, we have a program called Artificial Intelligence, Fact and Fiction, and that'll be with Sir Nigel Shadbolt. Sir Nigel Shadbolt was knighted by the Queen of England for his contributions to science, and he's also the chairman and co-founder of the Open Data Institute. And before I forget, and most importantly, I'd like to thank our sponsors tonight, Dr. Maureen O'Driscoll-Levy, thank you, and also EV, the Venezuelan newspaper of Houston, in particular Manuel Villasmil and Mariana Mateos. And lastly, and most importantly, I'd like to thank and also welcome to the stage Professor Julio Cardenas Garcia from the University of Houston Law Center. He's a great supporter of the council. He's also spoken to the council on numerous occasions. And most importantly, I'd like to say he's a good friend. He's someone myself and Julio have worked on issues related to Venezuela and get different speakers for, I think, 2 or 3 years now. And I just want to give you a brief introduction to him, and he is basically the reason tonight that we have such a wonderful speaker. He's the one who made this connection, helped coordinate bringing Mr. Lopez Hill tonight. So Julio Cardenas Garcia is a Venezuelan attorney and a research professor at the University of Houston Law Center, where he teaches courses on transnational petroleum law, transnational investment law and arbitration, and diplomacy and geopolitics of oil and gas. He's also taught these courses as a visiting professor in universities in Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and France. He has served as a career diplomat at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on Venezuela, where he worked on multilateral issues with the Organization of American States and the United Nations. Please join me in welcoming Professor Julio Cardenas Garcia. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronan, and good evening to everybody. I would like to start thanking to all of you for your response, attending this event in such a short notice. When we found the possibility to organize this event about a month ago, of course, we knew the situation in Venezuela, the current situation in Venezuela, will call a lot of attention, since it is a hot topic. So we were very lucky to found the opportunity to bring here today Leopoldo López Gil to have his views and his analysis and his personal experience on the situation in Venezuela. Leopoldo López Gil had his education in the United States, studying economics and government at the University of Columbia, and also finance with a master in finance at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm highlighting his education since he is, through his bio, I could read that he has two pillars, one as a businessman in the food industry and in the construction sector, also in the media as a member of the board of the important newspaper in Venezuela, El Nacional. But also he developed an important career in government, connected with the National Planning Ministry of Venezuela in different governments, and also as a founder and a head of the scholarship program Gran Mariscal de Ayacucho, who probably some of you from Venezuela benefit from one of these scholarships at some point, or you or your members of your family, in a time where Venezuelans could go abroad and study coming back. That program was that successful that students could return to Venezuela for decades, a reality that is no longer available for the students, that many of them are attending here at the university. Of course, Leopoldo López Gil is the father of Leopoldo López Mendoza, political prisoner of the regime of Nicolás Maduro. And we will have his views on the current situation. While we're here, Leopoldo is in prison. Students have been today on the streets. And, but this does not stop our concern and our interest to contribute to the reconstruction of this country. I would like to mention, just as a final remark, the book of Leopoldo López, Preso pero Libre, that you can find in English and in Spanish in Amazon, where you can find also information about his views, his political analysis on the situation in Venezuela. So with no further remarks, I would like to invite Leopoldo López Gil to the stage. Thank you.
And before we start, Mr. López Gil had asked if we could just recognize and have a brief moment of silence to recognize that over the last 6 weeks or so, over 70 people have been killed between the different groups and the protests that have taken place in different parts of Venezuela. So maybe we just join us in a short moment of silence. Thank you all very much. And just to start things, I would say, with the World Affairs Council, I've been fortunate enough to interview and work with a large variety of fascinating people, but you have one of the most fascinating industry bios that I've ever come across. As Julian mentioned, you have a background mostly as a restaurateur. You're also a professor in business school. You did your work with El Nacional, the major newspaper in Venezuela. Could you talk a bit about, especially because of what it relates to your work for El Nacional, and then also what Julian mentioned with regards to the scholarships and the work you did? I know you worked with both President Perez and also President Caldera directly for them in the government. Could you talk a bit about that?
Surely. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for coming. I do hope that I can refresh some of the information that we have on the sad situation that Venezuela is living today. On the Nacional, I started as a member of the council of the editorial council some 25 years ago. When we started renewing the paper, the paper had gone from the founders' generation to the new generation, which is the son and daughter of Miguel and Jose Calvo, who later on sold his share and went to and he's living now in Europe. But the family still owns basically the controlling share of the paper, so it still is a very family-owned business. I'm sorry, the crowd is a bit busy. And some 25 years ago, they decided that we should renew the paper. The paper is a traditional, very politically oriented paper. It was founded in the 1940s by the Otero family. The editor was the writer, Miguel, and the administrator was the brother, Alejandro. They really built what was probably the most recognized true frontal newspaper, but it was a bit leftist. We must remember that during the 20s and the 30s, Miguel, the founder, was a communist, a member of the Communist Party, which wasn't at all strange in those days, because the Communist Party was probably the only organized party during the dictatorship of Juan Vicente Gomez. So if you wanted to develop a modern view on politics, you either were left out or became a member of the Communist Party. Most of the true politicians that changed Venezuela were members of the Communist Party during those years. Rómulo Betancourt, for instance. But obviously, having that sort of a liberal mind, the paper has been always very liberal oriented. What happened in these years was, unfortunately, at one point we were, like I guess most Venezuelans, very uncomfortable with our democracy. Our democracy had developed since 1958 until the 90s into something not quite as desirable as we would have all thought or wished. We saw a lot of corruption. We saw a lot of mis-expenditure. And the country was growing into a separation of the very, very rich and the very, very poor. We were possibly among the founders of a movement to attack directly the then governmental officials, but we were not alone. In fact, in this desperate situation, we also had a very rightist group that owned Radio Caracas, probably the most conservative group in the media in Venezuela, who also was attacking our government officials. And what happened in those days was obviously we were successful in creating the fertile ground for somebody like Hugo Chávez to come up with a coup d'etat, an attempt in 1992. Fortunately, did not have success in it. But unfortunately for us, he planted the seed of discontent. He had a famous phrase when he was taken to prison. He said, "Por ahora." In the meantime, we have not succeeded. It was the plan for the real success that he foresaw, which unfortunately was, I would say, facilitated by the next president-elect, who was Rafael Caldera, who in my view should have never been president at his age. He was a very, very wise, very respectable person, extremely well educated, but I guess too old for the job, and a bit too ambitious. And I think in many ways we have come to the conclusion that he participated knowingly on the coup d'etat in '92, and later on he decided not to proceed with the judgment of the military that held the coup. So as soon as he became president, he left Chávez and his group free without a trial. They were never tried. They were never sentenced. So he had a free road for the participation in the coming election, which he did, and he won. He did win fairly. Once that happened, we, the media, decided to be also critical of Chávez, because Chávez wasn't doing what he was proposing. And in the years to come, finally, our views has cost some of us exile. About 22 members of El Nacional, La Patilla, and Tal Cual are now living outside of Venezuela, because we cannot go back unless we risk, well, what do you all know? A nice hotel that you don't have anything to pay for.
I truly appreciate your honesty and your kind of balanced view of what went on. I think to a lot of outsiders, they would say, how could this happen in the country that for many years was, in the 50s, the world's largest oil exporter. In recent years has been, I think by BP and other groups, has been stated to have actually the largest proven oil reserves in the world, ahead of Saudi Arabia now, I think 300 billion barrels. In that period, in the kind of 90s, what was the level of kind of mismanagement that led to such discontent that someone like Chávez could be, like you mentioned, could be elected freely and fairly by kind of a disheartened and kind of disillusioned, especially the poor in Venezuela, who probably felt like they weren't getting any representation?
It's interesting because we had a continuous growth period in Venezuela since 1958. But in the latter years and in the 90s, approximately actually in the 80s, this presidency of Jaime Lucinchi, the government was extremely mismanaged, to the point that when Carlos Andrés Pérez was re-elected or elected for his second term, he found almost no cash at the central bank, no reserves. It was terrible. Had we not had the banks themselves, after having a meeting with Dr. Pedro Tinoco and Dr. Miguel Rodriguez, who told them clearly, we are not in a position to pay you 1 more cent. In fact, you will have to lend us money so you can take your little interest payments in the next period. According to Miguel, that first meeting, all the bankers left. They got up and left. They thought it was, wow, we actually, this is, this is havoc. No. The next day, all the bankers came and said, okay, we'll lend you the money and you'll pay us the interest. And that's how the first months of Carlos Andrés' second government started, until the price of oil went up again. And we had happiness again. Unfortunately, that's hasn't happened lately. But no, when that happened, the country started again on a growth path, and on that growth period, the separation between the people that had and the have-nots became almost a 50-50%. 50% of the country was considered poor, and the other 50 was, well, they had something. Obviously, not everyone was middle class, but they had something. But as we were developing during the 90s, things were getting better until 1992. Then the coup d'etat created another wave that changed a little bit things. And then, of course, the Caldera years were worse. And that bridge between the poor and the rich was even greater. But today, under socialism, that bridge, it's 80%. 80% are poor, 20% are not poor. I'm not saying rich, not poor. So, if we want to learn something, it's that obviously we were not doing things well, but we haven't learned the lesson. We're doing it worse now.
Okay, and just to move on, obviously you talk about oil prices, and that's one thing. Chavez, probably perhaps like Putin, could not have timed his coming to power any better with regards to oil prices. If you're in a petro state, many years of some of the highest oil prices in many years. Obviously, when those collapsed, Chavez's regime, and then Maduro had a lot more difficulties. We won't necessarily get into all of that, but just to kind of move into where we are today. Obviously, your family has a long and kind of illustrious impact, both in basically with regards to the government, with regards to the media, El Nacional. I thought maybe we'd turn to your son, Leopoldo López Mendoza. For those of you who maybe aren't aware of it, he was convicted and given a sentence of almost 14 years by a trial that was, I think, decried by almost everybody on the left and the right and all over. I think out of 60 witnesses that his defense attorneys asked to have come to the trial, only one was allowed, and I didn't realize until you told me this afternoon. The one that was allowed was a shared witness between the prosecution and the defense. And he was also, I think, 30 or 35 pieces of evidence were refused to be admitted into court. So I think a lot of people would say it's as close as you come to a kangaroo court and a fraud trial. But sadly, he was convicted, despite plenty of evidence that wasn't allowed to be admitted, of they said he was convicted of inciting violence at some of the protests. Obviously, most people would disagree with that. Could you talk about his current situation, just for those of you who aren't aware of it? Besides his long and difficult sentence, most of that, a large part of that, is also in solitary confinement. And I know 2 years ago he also underwent a hunger strike. Could you talk about his situation? I know it's very difficult for you to discuss your family and your own scenario with your family, but if you wouldn't mind talking about him.
Yes. Leopoldo participated on the 12th of February 2014 on a protest that was called by the students in front of the prosecutors, the National Prosecutor's Office. He accompanied the students with 2 other political leaders, Maria Corina Machado and Antonio Ledesma, who, by the way, is the Metropolitan Mayor of Caracas. At the end of that manifestation, at the end of that protest, it was dissolved. People were going home. Leopoldo was already in his office when a guard from the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Government, a bodyguard of one of the minister or vice ministers, shot and killed 2 people that could be, one of them was a participant, of course, because it was a young fellow. The other one was not necessarily a participant. It was a member of the those informal groups that the government calls colectivos. When that happened, 2 hours after, not more than that, on national TV, the President of the Assembly, Lieutenant Diosdado Cabello, immediately said that Leopoldo was the culprit for those assassinations. And an order for his arrest was given, saying that he was an assassin, a terrorist, a third thing I can't remember. And then he went into hiding, and 4 days after, he handed himself in voluntarily. He said through his social media that he would do that at a certain point, at a certain time, and to the surprise of all of us, including the government, about 500,000 people were there with him. That day, he was taken to Ramo Verde. Ramo Verde is a military prison about an hour away from Caracas, on the state of Miranda. It's, I would say it's a very pleasant landscape, fortunately, because it's in the middle of hills and not much built around it. I won't say it's a wooden surrounding, but it's green and it's nice. But then Leopoldo was at the very beginning put with other prisoners in a separate building. There are 2 buildings there. One is holding presently about 180 prisoners, mostly military, but some are political. And in the other, in those days, they were only having Leopoldo and 4 other soldiers. And in the first floor, 2 officers that were there for conspiring, according to the government. As the years passed, as the time passed, like you learn, Leopoldo was given this very long sentence, and most of the people that were with him in that department, were taken away, and he was left alone, isolated, and he's been like that for the last basically 2 years. And in the past months, we were very worried because not even his lawyers or his family was allowed to see him. In fact, for 35 days, no one saw him. And a Venezuelan, a very respectable Venezuelan reporter or anchorman, unfortunately tweeted that he had from a good source that Leopoldo had been taken to a military hospital without any vital signs.
But thankfully, that was a rumor that was dispelled. Obviously, he's going through things, but just to let
obviously.
But to let people know, he's considering everything he's gone through, he is an incredible spirit, still very strong, very vibrant. Maybe he would talk about that, and maybe also just for any of your audience who aren't as familiar with it. I know you're too modest to say it, but I think most people who observe Venezuela or Venezuelans themselves would say, with regards to the opposition, of all the different opposition figures, he is probably the one that is the most popular, the one that people feel is most invested and has given the most. Also, he had a career in politics himself. He was a president of a region of Caracas, and, a mayor of a region of Caracas himself. So, maybe you could just talk about his spirits, and despite his incarceration, despite his, solitary confinement, how he still stays such a kind of inspirational figure.
Well, Leopoldo, since he was very young, and I must say, this is a story that one of the nannies of the children that were there told us, and we laughed at it in those days. He was probably about 6 or 7, and they were all with his friends playing on the garden, and the nanny asked, when you grow up, what do you want to be? And the first guy said, well, I want to be a cowboy. The next one, I want to be a policeman. And so on, so typical things, soldiers, doctors. When they got to Leopoldo, he said, and how about you? He said, I want to be president. And the nanny said, president of what? He said, I don't know, president. Well, in due time, he started his studies, and he always wanted to be a public servant. In fact, when he finished his studies as an undergrad, he went to grad school at Harvard, to the government school of government, Kennedy School of Government, to do a master's in public administration. And when he went back to Venezuela, he started working with the petroleum company, PDVSA, with the planning department, until he managed to get into politics and ran for the mayoralty of one of the departments of Caracas called Chacao. He won with 52% of the votes. I must say that when he decided to run, I did, during my youthful years, I used to do polls. So I polled, and I told him, you're crazy. You only have about 2% knowledgeable in this district. And he said, well, I'll work. And in fact, he did work so well that he won with 52% of the votes. And after 4 years of being mayor, he was reelected with 82% of the votes. So,
very admirable. Yeah, and we obviously wish him the best. Maybe just to kind of move on to the broader picture of where things are in Venezuela now. I think, Chavez, Chavez Maduro in a lot of ways couldn't be more different. Besides the obvious, Chavez, love him or hate him, he had obvious charisma. Maduro doesn't have much of any. But also, if one was inept, the other seems to be even more inept and perhaps even more corrupt when it comes to the government. With the severe political crisis and massive economic crisis now taking place in Venezuela, do you see any signs of conflict or disunity within members of the government, or say within the military or the colectivos or the militias that have been organized? Do you see any signs of that, or do you think people are perhaps at least maybe stepping back from their support?
On the government side, yes, we see a lot of I think, I won't say breaking from the party itself, but there is a lot of discontent, especially about the last measure that Maduro has proposed, which is calling for a new constitution, and people who have been very loyal to the revolution, such as the attorney, the general attorney, and certain professors like Giordani, have manifested that they do not believe that there's a solution, and in fact they also are contestant with us that it's not even a legal solution. It's an illegal solution that it's going to be imposed on the Venezuelan people. So yes, I do see signs. Some people say that they've seen signs within the military, which is a bit more difficult because it's a bit of a, not only it's a very protected population, but it's also a population that it's now being overseen by the Cuban intelligence. One thing that people say it lightly, but we have about 60,000 Cubans in Venezuela. Most are disguised as doctors or nurses or sports trainers, but they overtook all the identity institutions, the institutions that are responsible for giving us the birth certificates, the marriage certificates, our identity card, etc., etc. They're all plagued by Cubans. They also infested all the military headquarters, and they also are not only present, but they're also continuously informing of what's going on and who talks about what, and that's how so far they control. It's sad, but Venezuela, who's the size of Texas, with a population probably close to the same population of Texas, richer, like you say, than Texas, because we, in fact, have the potential of having more oil than Texas, or Saudi Arabia included. But yet, we were slaves to the Cubans.
And just
a Venezuelan gave away our independence. He gave it to the Cubans. Chávez, a military. And then, of course, Maduro. I don't know whether he knows what he's doing, but...
And then just for, on the other side of that equation, a lot of people would say that the opposition has a lot of wonderful potential, a lot of great leaders, but perhaps their divisions are within different factions of the opposition. People like your son or Maria Corina Machado, maybe that they're more willing to be more strident, to put more on the line, whereas somebody like Enrique Capriles, the recent presidential candidate who very narrowly lost to Maduro, is perhaps, people might say, maybe too moderate or too willing to work with the government. Can you talk about the current state of the opposition, who you think is leading it, and is there a degree of unity that's occurring?
It's been said that there isn't any unity in our, it's called the Table of Unity, Mesa de la Unidad. I disagree completely. I think the Mesa de la Unidad is a tremendous success, and it was proven in 2015, December, when you had 17 different ways of thinking, not necessarily 17 parties, but at least 12 parties and 5 groups of thought sitting at the same table, and they all came together, and they came and united and chose only one slot for their candidates. They chose, and they were in accordance with the method for selecting the candidates. And we held elections, and we now have 75% of our representation in the National Assembly. If that is not success, let me know what is success.
So maybe just also move on to something that I find fairly interesting, and I think no matter how dire the situation, perhaps at the highest political level, some degree of moderation or communication can occur. A story you told me is very interesting. In the 1990s, when you were working for the government, you're actually the person who introduced former President Jimmy Carter at the time to Fidel Castro. Pretty unique situation there. Do you see something similar possibly being able to happen? Somebody be able to kind of work together to kind of bring the different sides together in Venezuela? Perhaps maybe even a figure like Pope Francis, who worked behind the scenes for the U.S. and Cuban opening relations. Do you see any hope there?
Yes, I think that, unfortunately for Jimmy Carter, who you well said, I was just by chance. I was his civilian aide in 1992, in 1989, during the inauguration of President Perez. And a few rows ahead of us was sitting Fidel Castro, and whose civilian aide was a very good friend of mine, a person who's probably well known here in Houston because he's been involved in the oil business for some years. Andy Duarte. Andy and Carter, President Carter, told me that he was interested in meeting President Castro. I said, no problem. He said, yes, there's a problem. I don't want to be public about it. And he said, oh, then no problem. We'll do it. And we managed to get together, Andy and myself, and I said, okay, we'll just make it happen as an accident, as a casual thing, as we will be going out through the same exit, the same funnel from the theater. So there's no way of, but being face to face, and that's what happened. And they were introduced, and later on that night, Jimmy Carter went to see President Castro at his hotel. They had a long meeting. And the whole thing is taught us that people can be very different. But if you are well-meaning, if your intentions are honest, you can come to an agreement even with the most distant person. What has happened with Jimmy Carter, unfortunately for him, he did believe in Fidel Castro, in his honesty, and in 1994 he went to Cuba, and he was a promoter for the sort of respect of certain liberties that they had in their constitution. Curiously, the Cubans have, I don't know if they took it out then, but in the 90s they had in their constitution the right for a referendum. And Osvaldo Payá started a movement with the Catholic Church to have a referendum to revoke the authorities. Carter went there to sort of defend the right of that group. And as soon as Carter left, 300 people were imprisoned. 2 years later, Payá was killed. Is this Carter's doing? No, I think he's just well-meaning. The same thing happened with Jimmy Carter in Venezuela. He met with Chávez. He asked for respect for our elections, our election system, our referendum system. Chávez told him that he would do that, and as soon as Carter left, you know what happened?
Yeah. And just my colleagues out there in the audience, they'll be collecting. We have those blue question cards at the end of each rows. And if you'd like one, maybe just ask them for one if you don't have one already. And like I said, they're going to help me collect the question cards, and I'll read those here in just a few minutes. But maybe just one or two questions before we get to the questions from the audience. If a new government was to come into play, if a new government, would it be some form of moderated or kind of joint government or a complete change in government, how do you think the government would address the issues, especially with regards to the poor that for so long were, as we mentioned, kind of not treated well or perhaps even ignored or neglected for many years, but kind of make up the base of a lot of the Chavista support? What do you think a new government would do differently? And I know a lot of the opposition figures have said publicly that they would obviously want to reach out and do much more for the poor, for education and economic services like that. How would you think that would be addressed?
If there's one thing I would say easy to do in Venezuela, it's a lot easier to do it in Venezuela than in most countries in the world, is to have a better distribution of wealth. Why? Because our wealth belongs only to us, to the government, to the people. 90% of our internal product is produced by oil, petroleum. We just have to manage the distribution of the outcome of the product. What has happened in the past is the wealth distribution has been badly done. But it's not difficult to do it right. All you have to be is honest, among other things.
And then perhaps maybe an even more complicated or delicate subject to look at something like what happened in El Salvador after its civil war or after Nelson Mandela came to power in South Africa, when there's obviously very deep and long-standing historic divisions. You know, these aren't as long and historic as what happened in South Africa. But do you think something like truth and reconciliation commissions would be possible? Perhaps there'd be some degree of amnesty for people, at least up to maybe, except for those at the highest levels. What do you think would be possible or would be most effective to help the country move forward?
Amnesty definitely has to come. I don't think everyone in the other side is a bad person. I think punishment should be present as well. I don't think we can forgive certain crimes. I don't think we can be lenient about the causes of our impoverishment. But in general, I think a real commission of truth could do a lot of things in Venezuela. And because we must remember, it's a country for all Venezuelans. It's not just for one side, like Chavez decided. There was only those that were able to wear red that belonged to Venezuela, and the rest did not belong in Venezuela. No, Venezuela, it's for all of us. The red, the white, and the blue, and the purple, we all belong there. We have to get together in peace. So we have to forgive a lot. We are, unfortunately, very uncomfortable when we ask, would you forgive so-and-so? Yes. Yes. We have to forgive some of them.
All right, and I have a wonderful supply of questions. A wonderful supply of questions, and I know we could probably go for 2 or 3 hours just with the great questions from the audience. So if you all will bear with me, I might combine a few of them or shorten some of them just for the sake of time. But just one more thing I know just to address before we get into the audience questions. I know you're here in the United States. For a lot of you may not realize, we spoke about it earlier, basically for, unfortunately for obvious reasons, you're not able to return to Venezuela for over 2 years now. You're kind of living in exile and away from your family. But you're here in the United States, I think just try and promote and talk about what's happening to your son and more broadly about what's happening in Venezuela. When it comes to the issue of your son, there's broad bipartisan support from people like the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights to Secretary General of the Organization of American States, Luis Almagro, to President Obama, to even recently President Trump, who have all called for the release of your son. Two things. What would you specifically want the U.S. government to do specifically? And then at a more personal level, what would you think or kind of encourage just regular Americans to do with regards to the situation in Venezuela?
Let me start by telling you a personal story. After I finished my studies as an undergrad here, I went as an apprentice to a New York bank, a Chase Manhattan Bank in those days. And as an apprentice, I was invited to the stockholders meeting. The bank's president in those days was David Rockefeller. And it was a huge, 3 times as large a crowd as this is, huge crowd. And at the end of the meeting, when it came time for different points of view of the shareholders, one person got up and said, I would like to ask the president if you know that such and such and such a company are doing business with us. Of course, Mr. Rockefeller asked, I don't know, I imagine, but I don't know. I don't have the certainty of it. And he said, well, let me tell you. We are doing business with those people. And those people are doing business with South Africa. And in South Africa, there is a prisoner called Nelson Mandela. And they have a system called apartheid. They do not represent our values. I, as a shareholder, ask that we retire those companies from our clients, and any company that is doing business or will do business with that country. This is in the 60s. Pardon my age. Let me tell you that 2 weeks ago, Goldman Sachs, a very respectable firm from Wall Street. Wall Street stands for freedom, freedom of enterprise, freedom and democracy. What did Goldman Sachs do? They bought at 30 cents per dollar the hunger bonds of Venezuela. They are, in fact, feeding our government. I keep saying the only feed that the Venezuelan government gets comes from the US. If we stop buying oil from Venezuela in the US, who is the only paying client of PDVSA, if we make it impossible to have them do the business that they're doing with Citgo, our government would not last 2 days. Let us ask the US government and the US companies not to help our government.
And I think maybe just a follow-up to that, the United States is one of the few places in the world that actually can refine a lot of that heavy crude. So if it wasn't taken in the United States, they wouldn't have many other options. So I have a lot of great questions here about the current state of the protests, also of the opposition. A lot of people noting that it is truly remarkable that collectively with joint parties that now control 75% of the Congress, and people asking about the protests in particular. I know in the last few days, Enrique Capriles was injured himself, along with another opposition figure. I think he was injured in the head. A lot of people are asking, how effective are these protests, and should they continue, or do you think they need to do something else? I don't think people are talking in terms of a military solution, but is there something else that should be done?
For me, it's a difficult question to answer in the sense that I believe that Leopoldo proposed in 2014 to stay in the streets because that was the only way that we would have the government change. Unfortunately, he was not listened. Things changed until everyone understood that it is the only way. It is the only way. It's a very difficult, it's a very demands a lot of sacrifice, even the risks of life for many. In the last 60 days, to give you an idea, over 70 people have been killed, assassinated by the repression. Close to 2,000 have been injured, from very light injuries to very serious injuries. Over 3,000 people have been detained. Approximately 1,500 have been processed in military courts. Now the political prisoners are more than 300. When this started, there were less than 100. You tell me, is there a way of talking to a gorilla? Do gorillas understand? Do they play? No, there's no way. Since we are on the streets 60 years ago, fortunately for us, I think the world has finally understood that something is going on in Venezuela, something that means the sacrifice of our people, that people are not content with what we have, that there's no democracy in Venezuela, that there's no justice, and definitely no freedom. So yes, I think we have to stay on the streets.
And I had a lot of similar great questions from audience members asking what could those Venezuelans living outside of Venezuela do, particularly large populations here in the United States. I know big populations in Spain and other places. What would you encourage them to do, and how could they be more active?
Well, maybe some of you do not know what our diaspora has been in the last 10 years. Venezuela is a country with less than 30 million inhabitants. In the last 10 years, we think we have counted seriously, academically, by Professor Tomás Páez, approximately 3 million Venezuelans have left Venezuela. And very unfortunate for the country. Those 3 million are probably, among them, most of them, they're middle class, professional, and extremely well-trained people. We're not letting go the worst of the worst. No collectives, no colectivos are leaving the country, unfortunately. So, the first thing I would say is, please do not forget Venezuela. There's things that one never knows what one can do. My grandfather was in prisons and exile for more than 20 years of his life. My father for more than 15 in exile. I'm now in a position that I never thought I would be. I grew up in democracy. I never thought that I would have to be kept away from my country. But I do not forget Venezuela.
And maybe just for the sake of time, I might just do one or two more questions. With the severe economic crisis in Venezuela, it moves well beyond just massive currency devaluations and one of the highest rates, if not the highest rate of inflation in the world. There are also massive food shortages and also massive shortages of medication. Is there anything that you advise or would hope for with regards to the broader community in the Americas, the United States, or beyond that, even to the UN, to do to kind of help alleviate the situation right now?
Well, among the things that we have been doing from abroad is sending medicine, as you well know, with all the difficulties that the government has put in order to have those medicines distributed within the country. But we cannot do too much about the economy. The inflation is galloping. It's probably over 700% this year. Just the last sale of dollars that the government had this week, it's translated into a 64% devaluation of the Bolivar, officially. So decimado. So you can imagine that by the end of the year, having Bolivars will be like having marks in the Weimar Republic. Maybe 1 million Bolivars would do enough for buying a pack of cigarettes.
Wow. And maybe just another point you touched upon, obviously the influence, both kind of covert and overt, of the Cubans. Can you talk about maybe outside actors? China obviously has given massive amounts and massive loans to Venezuela. I think they also extended the credit on some of those, but recently have decided to cut back on issuing new loans. But with regards to the Russians, it goes perhaps beyond just financial assistance. Maybe you could talk some about that. And also, I know the Russians, a few years back, also had arms sales with Chavez and his government, and Maduro. I think something in particular that was of concern to a lot of foreign policy analysts was the sale of, I think maybe 5,000 what they call man-pad surface-to-air missiles. Obviously, with the current government's connections, both with Iran and possibly also with Hezbollah, that's a concern. Could you talk about the roles of China and Russia?
Yes, well, the Chinese, as far as we know, have not been involved in warfare armaments. They sold a few planes, but that's about it. What they did was exchange petroleum on a sort of a future basis. They bought oil and they sold us Chinese products or Chinese services. And this has mounted up to $60 billion as of last year. And I think they stopped. I don't know whether they believe they cannot get any more out of it, or whether they think that things would change soon. On the other side, the Russians, due to a deal that they crossed with our Ministry of Mines, were given the concession of oil fields to Rosneft. Rosneft is one of the Russian oil companies. And also they have a certain hold on shares of Citgo as a guarantee for a loan. And I understand, it's a loan that was already used to pay the past debt. But the new fresh money is coming, unfortunately, from the Goldman Sachs deal. Not too large. It's 2.3 billion, I think, that were paid at 800 million. That's all they paid.
And just, for the sake of time, and as a thing we talked about before, I definitely like you to take as long as you need if you'd like to give some closing remarks. And just obviously, I think for the sake of our great Venezuelan audience here tonight, please feel free to give remarks in both Spanish and then maybe English or whatever you prefer.
I think they listen to me in English, so I think they all
Okay.
either they suffered me for a long time or they understood some. Well, it's really, to me, it's been an incredible pleasure to be with you. I should not be here. I think you were actually should be listening to my son or to any of those heroes that we have lost. Andrés Eloy Blanco, a poet, once wrote a poem. It's a beautiful poem, but in the end, the conclusion is, once you have a son, you're the father to every child in the world. I feel